All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the BLD Financial Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Darren Voros. Darren's been in the real estate game for about 20 plus years now. Done a little bit of everything, but the last few years he's spent in the development side in the Toronto area. Has fundraised quite a bit of money as well too. Has built and invested in quite a few units and has learned a lot along the way. And I think you're a bit of a staple name kind of in the mid-size, like missing middle. I say quite a few people have heard about like you and the projects that you're doing, and you've learned a lot, and you've acted like a good mentor for quite a few guys. So I think it'll be a good conversation. Great to have you on, and I think lots for everyone to learn.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, great to see you guys.
Yeah, man. Usually when we start this, before we get into the meat and potatoes of what's going on, give people a little bit of an idea as to, obviously, you've been doing this for 20 plus years. How'd you get to being the guy who's developing right now? Like, how'd you start?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably a not so typical story. I would say I started in 2002 was the very first house I bought. I had a career before being a developer or being a real estate investor, and that was musical theater. And I worked 15 years professionally in theater, and one of those years I was over in Japan. I worked over there for Universal Studios, and I saved up a bit of money, and I came back, and I was like, what do I do with this money that I have saved? And somebody said, oh, you should buy real estate. It's a good investment. I knew nothing about real estate. I don't come from a family of real estate investors, but I was like, sure, I'll put my money in real estate. So I bought a house and went back on tour and did another show and was traveling, and for 4 years rented that property out. And then at the end of the 4 years, the Alberta market had gone sort of crazy, and I sold it. And I went and bought 3 properties in Ontario in about 6 months' time. And the first of one of those was like finally like a multi-unit, triplex. So I got my feet wet there, and then I started doing sort of more of those like duplex conversions and things like that, and actually getting into the weeds on the tools for multiple projects. And then about 5 years ago, kind of landed on the development space, almost like accidentally in a way. It basically was like a forced into development because the market was just like, well, if you're going to pay X amount of dollars for a property in Toronto, the triplex model just doesn't work anymore if you're paying, $3 million for a property essentially. So it's like, well, how do you get beyond that? Well, you got to go more units. And so kind of figured out, oh, actually the zoning allows us to go to 8 or to 10 units. And, that was sort of the path. It started very sort of organically. I grew my portfolio just slowly over time as I was working and saving up some money and doing some refinances and dumping it back into real estate. And then, 5-6 years ago, made a concerted effort to look at development more specifically. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So the last 6 years have essentially been just perfecting this strategy and kind of working on it exclusively.
I feel like there's 2 ways an investor gets into development. One is you realize like it costs the same or slightly less to build, or the second one is I bought an apartment building, realized I had to tear everything apart, and was basically like building it back up from the ground. And I was like, hey, I could do this. And then you move into like full scale development.
Yeah, the first 2 that we did were, when I say we, I just mean like my team and I, were like conversions. So we took an old house and extended it and topped it up and did all that stuff. And so it's like I did that twice, and then realized like for the same cost, I could just take this thing down and start again, and I get a better product, and I get,
and honestly, a little bit less headache too than probably doing.
For sure. You spend, in that case, you spend 3 months doing demolition and all that kind of stuff and underpinning and all these things. It's like, well, you do a new build, it's like that thing comes down in about 3 days, right? And you got an empty lot, and now you can just start building again. So it's like, there's costs to doing that, but in the end, you get a better product when you're basically tearing down and rebuilding.
Behind wall number 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which you always find on these old century homes in Toronto.
Always. And, usually, same thing, starts organic for most people, and then it's a scalability issue too, right? Like income can only support so much.
Yeah.
Now I need more income to be able to service the debt. That doesn't work. Increased density. And we've had a lot of things happen since you started getting in, like as of right zoning changed across the city. Products became more readily available. CMHC as a whole has become more streamlined in the, I guess, like kind of popular culture, I guess you call it. Like everybody now knows the products and what they have. Federal, municipal, products are coming out around like DC deferrals or now DC waiving,
No
HST,
HST,
like things that are, I call it the golden age of development, because
Yep.
for the longest time, guys were fighting about approvals, they were fighting about zoning, and you weren't really able to build things. And we're now at a stage where you can go and do it. Not everybody can go do it, but like you can now go and do it without massively cutting down timelines
Yep.
and your costs and starting to make numbers work again.
Well, and we were one of the first, our Dovercourt project, I think, was probably one of the first, 50 applications in with MLI Select. It had just come out. And so we were, one of the first ones that's actually renewing in like a year, like 18 months, something like that. So we're finally hitting that 5-year mark on our first project. So MLI Select was like, no one had ever really heard of it. And we were kind of looking at it going, well, this is a great product. And that sort of, spurred, more development. But we were paying HST. Our development timelines were stretched because, the municipal approval process and whatever else, and just wrapping our heads around that. And it is getting easier, I would say, with every single day that passes. It's still not easy, but it's definitely getting easier and more cost effective as we move forward. They're just kind of stripping out some of these things that have made it cost prohibitive for some people to get into this space.
And I feel like it's out of, again, necessity. I think the federal government understands that things need to be built, and private capital needs to flow towards something that's going to be profitable. And as it stood, there wasn't anything happening, and it wasn't profitable to be able to do these things. So as you continue to move forward with all these grants and whatnot that you get, like it's really pushing the missing middle housing, and that whole movement has turned from backroom conversations to a real movement. There's like a lots of events now, huge groups. You have policymakers across the board, federally and provincially, coming together and pushing it. It's kind of created this explosion of missing middle development and housing on low rise, and then you have developers like yourselves who are getting in the weeds and navigating what can I do with one unit, and if I split it, or what are the zoning laws around these things. It's a little bit more complicated, but people are starting to really kind of get the blueprint and figure it out.
Yeah, there definitely is a massive movement seemingly in this space. I don't know how many people have actually executed on projects. That's the big question that I always have, because a lot of people are talking about it for sure, but I think there's very few people in this space so far that I see that have executed on multiple projects. That could be a byproduct of maybe their first one didn't go very well and they don't want to do it again, or they were expecting to have perhaps less capital involved, and then they kind of thought, I can do this with 5%, that magic number that everyone talks about, and then they realize it's closer to 25 or 30, and they're like, well, I sunk everything I had into that one development, and there really isn't a lot of ways to get it out once it's in there. Either you're holding for that initial term, and then you're maybe refinancing after that 5 or 6 years. But I think that's another myth in this space, is people think I can just refinance it or whatever when it's done. I'm like, that's not really how it works, because it's based on cost and it's not based on value, in most situations if you're going with CMHC. So there is a lot of things to navigate, and I always talk about this, from a beginner's perspective. I learned so many lessons on those first couple projects, and a lot of the people that I, sort of worked with over the years were like, yeah, you took all the arrows for us, so thanks so much. I'm like, yeah, it's great. Glad I had to learn all those lessons, and every lesson was like 50 or 100 grand a piece. Yeah. But now we're sort of at the other side of that, which is we've finally figured out the formula that works, and we're implementing that, and basically seeing the kind of results we were hoping for, let's say 5 or 6 years ago.
Construction's really, it's there's a lot more of a learning curve and going through, and you really have to get into the mud of it to really understand it. And not that it doesn't also apply to just general purchasing and repositioning of assets, but I think there's a lot more on the construction side, understanding you're going through 2 different phases of capital. You're gonna have your construction costs, your construction loan, then you're gonna have your takeout loan, learning how to transition between the two, get everything set up with having substantial and just posting substantial completion. The steps that go in between that, there's so many people who don't even realize there's an actual step that you have to be able to post it and have that ready to go, and then getting the lease up, and then understanding how do you transact out. It's not based on your as complete value, it's based on your project cost. And I think that through a lot of newer investors and developers for a loop when they're running all their performers and look at this money that I'm going to make. It's not like that. You're still going to have some equity left in there.
Yeah.
You really do, and you really have to go through it, and it's something that takes a while to master too. Because we were talking about this just before we jumped on, like how many projects that you guys have been through, and you know, you're finally like, yeah, I think we've kind of finally nailed that. We're finally getting our costs down into a level that's really going to help us be profitable. And that's where I think a lot of people start to make the mistake of like, they get it and they're like, okay, we're going to jump to the larger ones now, versus like, you know, hey, let's just continue to master this and let's actually make some money here that we've figured it out. And now that we've really like brought our costs down instead of just jumping into larger units.
Well, and I think there's such a difference between like when I was doing duplex conversions or I built my first triplex, I think that's a manageable thing for a relatively new, inexperienced investor. Even the jump from 3, like let's say to 8 or to 10 units, it's a big difference. The commercial financing alone, I mean, you guys know this better than anyone. It's just like it's a whole new beast. It's like a whole new thing you've never really experienced before. And then going from let's say 10 units to 40 units, you know, I think people think, oh, I've done an apartment building, like a small boutique apartment building, Part 9 of the building code here in Ontario, and I'm just going to jump up to 40 units. Well, that's a whole different, you know, element as well. And so I think there's people that get caught up in that. Like you say, they want to go to that next level. Like, yeah, I mastered that one because I did 1 or 2 projects. I'm going to go to the next level and have the same kind of success. And in my experience, I'm like, that's a whole new learning curve that could take you 3 or 4 projects again to learn how to really execute at that level too.
I think that's where like a lot of the lender pushback comes from with experience too. And, you know, we get a lot of pushback from our clients as to, oh, I built this ground up house or this duplex, and you know, it's significantly different than, you know, a 10-unit building. And, you know, the 2 pillars of construction capital, really capital and, you know, experience. And we're getting definitely more pushback, because I think I call them retail developers. Like, it's the people who invested in their retail money, but they're becoming developers. And it's this whole new subsection of developers. And like, you know, bridging that gap is really difficult to do. And getting to the stage where, you know, as you said, you spend $50,000 on, you know, a mistake. How many of those $50,000 mistakes can you absorb until you have the experience to be able to go and do it? So that jump, it might seem small, but it's large, and you know, it costs real dollars to do. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners would like to hear about, you know, maybe some of those mistakes and some of those things that did cost you that those dollars. Like, what, you know, walk us through a few of those like challenges with some of those projects, because I know, you know, some of them are incredibly difficult to deal with, and you know, obviously you've learned from them.
Well, I'll give you a couple of really interesting ones, at least from my perspective. You can tell me whether you think they're interesting or not. But so one of the first ones we had that we ran up against was, we bought a building that was it was zoned as a single family dwelling. It was the second conversion we ever did. It had 7 apartments in it, but they were all illegally created, right? So it was on paper, from the zoning perspective, single family dwelling, 7 illegal units in there. No one had ever legalized them. So we went to the city and said, okay, we want to make this a legal 8-unit apartment building. And we submitted our applications. We were just about to go to committee of adjustments, I believe, for a couple of minor variances. And then they came back and they're like, oh, this has to go through Toronto Rental Housing. And I was like, what is Toronto Rental Housing? And they're like, oh, it's when you want to take an apartment building and convert it or change it, adding or subtracting units. And I was like, well, no, it's a single family dwelling. Like, we checked with the zoning department, we checked with everybody, and they're like, well, no, it's a 7-unit apartment building. I'm like, no, those units were never legalized. And they're like, it doesn't matter. I'm like, what do you mean it doesn't matter? I'm like, okay, so you're telling me that somebody went and created 7 illegal apartment units. 2 of them don't even meet the rule for what an apartment is. It wasn't the right size. It was too small. It was basically a room. And they were like, well, now you're converting those illegal units to legal. You have to go through Toronto Rental Housing. And I was like, this makes no sense. And I said, okay, so tell me that on the back end that you're going to say that we have 7 units currently in our building and that we'll be exempt from development charges, and we're only going to be adding 1 new unit. And they're like, well, no, because no one ever paid the development charges on those units. So you have to go through Toronto Rental Housing, and you have to pay for adding 7 new units from a development charge perspective. And so what they did is they're like, what were the rents on these units? And I was like, I don't know. We bought a vacant building. It's been vacant for a year. And they're like, well, just estimate what the rents were. 2 of the units were like 135 square feet. I'm like, I don't know, what would that rent for? Like $600? I don't know. And they're like, oh, okay, so that's deemed affordable. So now when you replace that unit you have to put affordable, and City of Toronto affordable housing, that which is different than CMHC affordable housing. That's like you have to go through their affordable program. You have to select one of the agencies that then you have to work with to put an affordable tenant in there. So this was like our second project.
What a nightmare.
And then we go to try to finance it with CMHC, and they're like, well, no, they read the appraisal report, and the appraisal report had also mentioned these 7 illegal units. And like, well, it was an existing apartment building, so we couldn't do MLI Select. So then we had to do MLI Standard, and now we're stuck with these affordable rents and these parameters. And so we got knocked down from 50 years to 40 years on our amortization, which changed our debt coverage, and we had to go to 1.2, and we had to do a 10-year term versus 1.1, 50-year amortization. I mean, all of these things just kind of like seemingly got thrown at us. And what it really did is like basically we left about $600,000-$700,000 on the table that we were expecting to get refinanced out. And it's like, okay, you're kind of like scrambling and getting this building done, and you end up in a very different position than where you were expecting to go. And that was, I had really good partners on that one, where they were just like, I kept them in the loop the whole time of like what was happening. And I think it was a bit of like, I didn't know, they didn't know, nobody really had experienced this before. They were pretty good about saying like, okay, we'll figure out what we need to do to make sure that we can keep the product and keep it, in the portfolio, and we'll figure out how to, come up with this shortfall. But that was one of the first ones, and it was really like a difficult situation. And luckily, the city did work with us a little bit, because anything more than 5 units, if you want to change more than 5 units, you have to go to city council for approval. So like, they're like, okay, this one's a 2-bedroom, and you're going to add another 2 bedrooms, so that one's not going to be counted. And so luckily they got it to 5 or less. So then we just needed like basically a stamped approval, which we got from their Toronto Rental Housing. But yeah, that was our second project, basically.
Surprised there was a third.
Yeah, well, then the third one went even worse. The third one was basically, long story short, we were kind of like subcontracting ourselves, and we decided, let's go for a full service builder. Let's hire somebody. So we ended up hiring somebody who was marketing themselves around. They had done all these kinds of projects before. They had a big name behind them. It was like a builder that had been in the space in Ontario for many, many years. I later found out that this person had bought this company specifically for their name and the history around their name, and then was basically swindling people out of money. We wrote him a check for $800,000. He came to site for like a week. I did about $50,000 of work. We never saw him again. And we basically we had a $2 million hole in the ground, and our investor capital was basically gone. And so I had to like scramble and figure out, how are we going to get this project done? I had personal guarantees on all the loans. It was just like, all right. So I started just selling off assets, and like, we have to finish this product. And in the end, it cost us $7 million to build. And it was worth $5.5 million when we were done. So those 2 projects, most people would have probably given up at that point.
There's a fence.
I don't know why. I was like, okay, we can still make it happen. And so, I mean, just luckily, I've had amazing investors along the way. And then, of course, project number 4, we kind of turned around, and it was our first, I would say, like, semi-successful one from beginning to end, with not a lot of challenges along the way. And then since then, we've really sort of refined our model and used all those experiences to kind of put us to where we are right now, which is our next couple projects are on paper and in reality looking a lot different. And we changed a lot of our systems too. But I learned so many lessons on those first 3 or 4.
There's something to be said about like kind of going through the shit though. Like, there's no better way to learn than to really just get like absolutely like kind of dumped on with policy and zoning and this and that, and just like again, like learning while being on fire literally is really the best way. I mean, like the best way of just specifically learning, not maybe the best way to have like the best outcome, but I mean, if you're gonna learn, like you might as well learn it all at once. I guess. Like you might as well just figure it all out.
A 2-year span, it was like, I didn't. I had a lot of sleepless nights. For
it's
sure.
definitely better saying that now than then.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, and I mean, you came out on the other side of it, so it might be a different conversation if those were your last, final 2 and only.
And it could have been. I mean, very
100%.
Easily, right? I mean, it could have been literally, it could have wiped me out entirely. Yeah. Like it was on. I was so close to, luckily we had equity in a couple of our projects. And like I say, I had a portfolio of properties at that time. I basically liquidated everything and put it all into that one project to save it. I put $1.5 million of my own dollars into it, which is still in that property today. But, that was really about a relationship with my investors. And I was like, I have to make sure that I protect their investment. Because I could have walked, and I think some developers and even some of my investors were like, look, we're in other projects, and people that have been in this exact same scenario, they've just said, I'm walking. I'm not going to put my own capital at risk. They feel bad for, losing our capital, but they essentially walked away. And I was like, I would never be able to sleep at night if I knew that was, if I had the ability to try to make this happen and I didn't do everything that I could.
That's why there's a project 5 and 6.
Yeah, and I think that's why
tell people to have liquidity.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I was fortunate in the sense that like I had that liquidity, but also I think it's been a philosophy that I've had through everything that I've done. I mean, I've seen a lot of bankruptcies over the last couple of years, and when I look at people's numbers, I'm like, how do you have $20 million of capital that you've borrowed and you have $5 million of assets? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? And I've seen multiple scenarios like that, and so through it all, I've always tried to maintain a position of I like equity investors versus debt investors, and I think a lot of people fell into that trap too. And then also like making sure that there's enough in the portfolio to cover if everything went to hell, then it's like you could liquidate and pay everybody back and go on your way.
Prudent borrowing for sure.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about things that didn't work. Maybe like you said, you kind of have things refined. What are you looking at now in Toronto now that you've figured out where your kind of North Star is?
Well, out of the $800,000 check that I wrote to the contractor who walked away came sort of the idea of creating my own crew. I had 3 really good friends that were in the construction industry. I was in the trades for a little while and working alongside of some of these guys, and I knew them. And I was like, they're working in construction, I'm doing construction, why don't we try to figure out something that we could build together? So I started assembling my own crew, essentially. And so that was the first one that really helped turn the tide. Just people that I could rely on. Really, in construction, as you guys know, there's a lot of gaps, right? Mm-hmm. So like between trades, you'll have these little things where that's not part of the framer's scope, but it's also not part of the electrician's scope or whoever else's scope. And so there's this gap, and like, who's going to fill that gap? And so having my own crew to be there to say like, oh, okay, well, we've got to just do this one little thing, and then they can come in and start doing their work. That was the first thing that we sort of established. And now I have an 8-person construction crew. We can basically manage about 4 or 5 of our own sites at one given time with our sub trades as well. So that helps a lot. And then the other thing is just looking at our build cost and what we're paying and simplifying our design. So when we first took a look at our first couple projects, we had inherited one. We bought one from somebody who had gone through site plan approval and got it approved and then handed it off to us. And architecturally, it's really nice. It looks really great. And then I'm like, to try to build it, it's a nightmare. And I'm like, why for an apartment building? Like, I get the architect wants to put their stamp on it and they want to say, look at this beautiful building. But tenants are not going to pay more because you've got balconies inset from other ones, and it's a nightmare. You got to have steel and you got to have all these different things. And like, build a box, essentially, make it look nice on the outside, give it some design characteristics, make the inside really great floor plans, really nice space, furnish it nicely. Don't scrimp on those kinds of things, but really keep your designs as simple as possible. So our new design is essentially it's a giant rectangle, basically. It's got balconies and things like that, but they're really simple. Everyone has their own dedicated entrances, which helped save on fire alarms. We don't need a fire alarm in our buildings because they're essentially like stacked townhouses now. All wood framing, no steel in the building at all. We have a couple like steel structural walls, but those are simple to build. We've gone back and forth with our trades many times on like, how do we value engineer all this stuff? And then ultimately those trade relationships, when you start getting into project 4 and project 5, that's when you're going to see savings. I think everybody comes into development and goes, well, I want the best deal because I'm giving you this like 8-unit building and the drywall contractor's scope is $200,000. The drywall contractor doesn't know you from anybody else, and they want to see how you're going to work just the same way that you want to see how they're going to work. So on project 1, you're going to get their price that, you know, they're going to quote on any project they've never worked with somebody before. And it's on project 3 and on project 4 that they start to understand, okay, they pay their bills on time, their sites are always clean, they're easy to work with, they make us more efficient. So then you'll start to see price savings. But on those first couple projects, nobody's really giving you a great deal unless they're starving. And there is some people out there that are starving for work right now. But I really started to see the cost savings now that we're coming into project 4 and project 5, and we start to figure out which trades are the best. And then what, you know, how can they help us value engineer the building as well?
I think anyone in the service industry can relate to like the worst way to start a relationship is like all of a sudden you're just immediately on pricing and cost. Like,
Give
you're
me a
just
deal.
one of 700 other guys with a project that's come to us and said you should be thankful I'm bringing you something to work on and you should give me the best deal. Like,
How about quality and speed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the worst way to start a relationship.
Yeah.
Like, and to your point, I don't know you. Like I didn't, you know, I'm not coming to you looking for work. Like you came to me and your proposition is I'm going to bring you something, but you're going to do it on, you know, like 60 cents of the dollar of everybody else. Like
the carrot with the stick doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, we're also really lean in the office, you know, sense. Like, I think this is why I love this space. Like, we kind of talked about like going bigger, but I'm like, I don't really have any desire to. I think that when you look at the, let's say like the duplex or triplex investor, they have a hard time stepping up to the 8 to 10 unit building. That's a bit of a capital jump. And like I say, it's a knowledge gap for many people that have never worked in commercial financing or construction financing. And then for the bigger players, like the, you know, 40, 50 to let's say 200 units, they've got way too much overhead. They can't scale down to come into this space. It's just, you know, have to be really lean. And so my office is me. I got 2 full-time people and 1 part-time person. So we're lean on the office side. And then on the construction side, like I say, we've got 8 people, but the projects essentially pay them, right? And so it's also finding that sweet spot too of like making sure you've got enough people to execute on your projects, but not getting 10 people in the office and all of a sudden you don't have enough revenue to make payroll every single month. And so it took us a while to find that balance there too.
The experience gap of like building wood and then jumping into larger projects where now you got concrete, like that's like, you know, talking about experience and translating of like, you know, building single family homes to building like a 6-unit or an 8-unit building. That doesn't correlate. And then building like 6-story stick frames to going into like concrete, like that also doesn't correlate. Like the experience requirements on building concrete are even heavier than building on like wood frame. So it's like, you know, figure out the wood, master the wood frame, figure out how to maximize your dollar per square foot. And then even when you've built like 10 of these stick frame buildings, like you still don't have the experience of building with concrete. Like even that jump there is going to change. Like it's going to render your CV like almost not completely useless, but again, like the experience you need for concrete is way more than building with stick.
Yeah, which is why we avoid it at all costs. Yeah.
And I mean, like what you've done is you've highlighted, you know, what it looks like settling into a new, you know, subsection of the market, something that's new.
Yeah.
You know, the big guys, you know, you talked about, you know, being lean and whatnot, but it's also a capital thing. The big guys don't want to cut an equity check for $1 million. It's not worth it to them. It's too much risk. It doesn't make sense on a return. Yeah. So you have like this new group of development housing where, you know, you got to be perfectly lean enough to be able to make it happen. You have to be vertically integrated to be able to keep the costs down. Yeah. You have to have enough capital to be able to play the game. And usually it's not a big firm. You know, it's going to be either your capital or a few investors' capital. It's this like ecosystem of almost grassroots development that it's growing, but it's not for institutional profit. You know, it's either, you know, you're building family legacy or you know, the investors are building and developing to, you know, what they want in like their investment portfolio. But again, it's that almost retail, like experienced retail capital is flooding into this space, I'd say, just because the opportunity is no longer there in that retail space to scale, or just doesn't make sense anymore. Yeah. At least what we've seen is capital's flowing to guys like yourselves who have experience and they know what they're doing and they have a blueprint and a plan and a team. Yeah. And there are very few people, as you said, who can like execute multiple of these at the same time and do it effectively and still create a return.
And our capital requirements have come down too. I mean, I think like, there's a big difference between what we need to leave in the deal versus what we need to execute on the deal. And this is one of the things that I've been harping on new developers. They're like, oh, CMHC will do 95% loan to cost. And I'm like, yes, but that's what you need to potentially leave in the deal, but not to execute on the deal. Like, what about, your trades and when they want to deposit? So CMHC doesn't pay deposits. Your QS is not going to approve. Your electrician wants a 10% deposit. So where's that money coming from? You got HST rolling over month. And so I always say, like, you need at least 25 to 30% of the project cost in liquid capital. And I see a lot of CMHC underwriting now. They're like, they want to make sure you're more liquid. I think when people first started, they didn't have that requirement, but now it's definitely like one of the first things that we're getting asked is like, okay, what happens when, this happens and this happens? Where's that liquidity going to come from? But, when we have that kind of capital set aside now, we just know that we're going to be able to execute well and streamline everything. And then, yes, at the end of the day, when we flip to our term loan, or let's say we go with construction with one lender and we go to CMHC with another one, we know that we're going to be able to exit that capital out, but not during the construction process. We're going to need a lot more liquidity, a lot more capital available before we can, essentially end up with that lower amount when we end up on a stabilized asset.
Yes, preaching the reality of it. So let's dive into that a little bit. Let's say 95.5. Yes, that is. Let's assume you're going to get 95.5 on the back end of your project. You're 5% equity. You have to buy the property. So realistically, if you have to demolish the house to get CMHC construction, you got to demolish it first. You can't really have a mortgage on it unless you're rolling dice with the big banks, which I don't condone.
No.
And then you have your soft costs, all your drawings, all your permits, everything that usually goes in before you get your construction financing. And then realistically, they probably want to see a shovel in the ground to be able to get some work done and get your first draw. And then you get your first draw at 95% on your cost based on what you spent to date. Realistically, on these projects, these 4+1s, 5+1s in the city, you're $1 million of you need $1 million at least of capital to comfortably play this game. So, if anybody's telling you otherwise, you're either extending yourself or you don't have the experience of going through this. But it's $1 million check minimum.
Exactly, and that's what we've proven out over the last couple of projects. We're doing one that right now that's the biggest project we've done to date. It's 18 units over 2 lots. So we found a large lot, we subdivided it. So I essentially see it as like 2 of our regular projects just combined into one. So yeah, we're $2.5 million in right now. We're just about to get our first draw, and we'll essentially get a check written to us so we can pay out some of our private capital. But for that first, we've been in this for 14 months now. So we needed to have that $2.5-3 million of liquidity to then get to that first draw, and then then it's going to look a little bit different as we move forward. But yeah, absolutely. So on one of our projects, which is essentially half of that, we plan for $1 to $1.2 million, and then in the end we're leaving, let's say $500,000-600,000 of capital in there, but we need the 1.2 to at least get it done.
Well, and that check too, like, it's not separate equity check, like it's just part of your construction cost. It's not like you're getting additional money on top of that. Like, you still have to put that to use accordingly. And that's not even considering, like, from when you purchase the land to maybe having a mortgage on there and carrying that for maybe 12 to 18 months, depending on where you're building, because you have to get your approval. So you're going to have interest there. Maybe especially in today's market, like, it takes you 6 months to lease up your building, and maybe you run past your interest reserve. Like, there's some capital out of the pocket that you're going to have to carry as well too. Like, there's just so many unexpected stuff. Like, going back to the QS conversation, like, I think we were talking about this maybe in the last few weeks or whatever, but the difference of a progress inspection versus going in through a QS. Like, QS is going to get you more money back than a progress, but even then, you're not considering any sort of upfront deposits. If you're, I say lucky or whatever, and you're in the situation where you're using a progress inspection, 99% of the time, what you're getting progress wise isn't matching up to an invoice, because progress doesn't equate to builder profit or overhead or labor costs that are getting added in. You're getting that back at the end of the day at the end of the project, but you could be 65% progress, but you're only getting 55% of your construction costs. I mean, there's a 10% gap there that is more money that you're gonna have to cover out of your pocket, and that can easily add up to you could be $600,000 kind of behind on your invoices just due to how like your tranches are being like percentage wise completed. So
Well, even lien holdback is another item, right? Which
10%,
most
yep.
people that are first into construction projects, they don't know about it. And
HST.
most lenders now are saying like, we are not going to release lien holdback until 60 days after substantial completion. Well, tell me one trade that wants to wait. Like my foundation contractor is not going to wait till 60 days after substantial completion, which is probably a year later, to get their lien holdback money when they're entitled to it after 60 days of them not being on site. So there's another cash outlay. And if you've got like in our case on our new 18 unit building, that's like a $3 million hard cost construction. If you take 10% of that, that's an extra $300,000 of capital that you kind of need to have sitting there liquid to make sure you can pay out those lien holdbacks and keep those trade relationships happy.
You're
right?
covering it every single draw.
Yeah, exactly. You know? And so it's all those little things, those little nuances. And we finally got our HST system where we're like, okay, we got to file monthly because it's just too much capital outlay. And you want to be, staying on top of that. So you're getting that check back every month for like, let's say 20, 30,000. But that's hugely helpful as you roll through these multi-million-dollar projects.
Yeah, the most capital intensive investment strategy you could possibly have. Let's dive into what's working. So I mean, I've financed a bunch of these mid-market projects in Toronto. Some are wildly successful. Some are unfortunately not wildly successful. What are you seeing as the most important thing? Like, are you building using energy and 10% affordable? Are you using the MLI product? If so, is it location based? What size units are you looking at? How are you engineering your projects to get this to work?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a big proponent of the core of Toronto. It has the best zoning. So I know there's this whole strategy around sort of the 4+1. I've never really liked that because I think it's really hard to make those numbers work. So the 4-unit as of right zoning is essentially in the perimeter of Toronto. So like the Scarboroughs and sort of the North Toronto, like the Etobicoke areas, those have like that zoning that only allows up to 4 units plus a garden suite or laneway suites, you're up to 5. I prefer the core of the city, which has R zoning, and R zoning basically says there's no restriction on unit count. So you can go anywhere from, up to an apartment building. There's no restriction there. So that's the first thing that I always look for is like, do we have R zoning? And we've fluctuated. Our first couple projects were 8 units. Then we went up to 10 units. We always stay under 10 because in Ontario, we want to stay under that exemption for site plan approval. In Toronto, we had one project that started in site plan approval. We were a year and a half in. The rule change came out. Bill 23 came out. Everything under 10 units was site plan exempt. And City of Toronto called us and they're like, hey, guess what? Your project doesn't need to go through site plan approval anymore. We're like, cool. Can we get the last year and a half back and the $300,000 we spent?
Yeah, all my carrying
costs.
And
they're like, nope. But good luck. You can go straight to permit. And so we now stay underneath that 10-unit marker, specifically for that reason. And now we're shifting between 6 units because it is essentially no development charges. But with the new rule change that just came out where they're exempting up to 60% of our development charges for 2-bedroom units and higher, we'll have to really analyze the numbers. But my guess is it's going to shake out to be about the same or maybe even a little bit better to go back to our 8-unit model, which is 8 units in the house plus a garden suite or a laneway suite. With those reduced development charges, the numbers probably just make a little bit more sense. If you think about a basement apartment that we're essentially starting with a 2-bedroom unit and we split that into 2 1-bedroom units, you're generally going to get higher rents on 2 smaller units than you are on 1 larger one. So that's the only change that we really make. But we've got a nice unit mix in our buildings now. We've got some bachelors, some 2-bedrooms, some large 4-bedroom, 3-bathrooms. And we find that that's kind of the model that's working right now. We only need a lot that's like 30 feet wide, 30 by like 120 ideally, something like that. And of course, the prices have come down for the first time in about 20 years. So we're buying properties less than we've ever paid before. And I can give some rough numbers of like sort of our project costs. Buying land for anywhere between like, let's say 1.2 and 1.5 million, spending about $500,000 in soft costs. building for around 1.5 million. That's about 7,500 square feet between the house and the laneway suite. That's at $200 a foot, which most people can't build at that. We've really worked hard to get it down to that number. And then we're about another $500,000, let's say, in, carrying costs, and that's with the land purchase and all that kind of stuff. So we're in for about $4 million. And then we're getting a loan on the back end anywhere between $3.5 and $3.8 million. And that's where we can kind of hit that 90 to 95% loan to cost, but each one of those projects can basically leave anywhere between $500,000 and $600,000 in the deal, and we're sitting on about the same amount of equity when we finish the product. So our build cost is $4 million, and we're looking at a valuation of around $4.6 million using like a 4.5% cap rate. And so that's the sort of formula that's really working for us right now. And we're just like in that mode of like, okay, just rinse and repeat on this now.
And you're shovel to substantial in 12 months or less?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. So we're getting our timelines now really close to 18 months from acquisition to stabilization.
So it's obviously another benefit of sticking within that like sub 10 units is like your expedited build times are way quicker. Like you're not sitting in your project. And in today's world, like CMHC changes policies at least once a year. So I mean, the quicker you can get in and out of this project, the less time you have to be able to be exposed to any sort of just like policy change, socioeconomical factors, just stuff like that. Like there's a lot of guys I've talked to that, are sticking that 10 and under just because of how quickly they can get in and out. And they're not worried about sitting in there, taking time, extra time, spending money, holding costs, stuff like that. Like it's the expedition of your project is huge.
The average project in Toronto, like let's call a 100-unit tower, if you will, takes 10 years to build, right? So if you tell me like in 10 years you can add 100 units to the market, I'm like, okay, cool. I can do that in the same amount of time if I did one project per year, basically, right? And so I think that there's now this, like I say, there's this movement towards these smaller projects that you can still add units significantly year over year. But yeah, if the rules change or if the market changes or something happens, you're really only 18 months, 24 months from the time you've acquired the property till the time you've got it tenanted. And that's a lot easier to be versatile and make changes and see what's happening in the market. I mean, basically now I'm like, I don't want any small units anymore. Like right now, it's like 2-bedroom is our minimum because they've got all of these condos that are for rent and they're all 350 junior 1-bedrooms, right? And they're trying to rent these things out. I don't want to compete with that, right? And so everything we have is like 2-bedroom plus. We had to have some smaller units on this latest project just from like a zoning change, but really you have to kind of like look at the market, look what there's a need for, and you can make those changes every once in a while if you need to on a short timeline.
I think you also, I was going to say too, like you have to look at like your end goal of these projects too, right? Like going back to how you're talking about like kind of sticking away from the 4+1s, like at some point you're going to have to sell the portfolio. Like the end goal is to get the equity at the end of the day. Like building in desirable areas is one thing, but also building like a desirable project. Like how many people are going to want to go buy a 4+1 in 10 years versus buying, like an 8 or 9 unit type like project. Like you're gonna have way more appetite for something like that than you would on a 4+1, just with the unit makeup, the size of it, even just the size of the buy at the end of the day. What does that look like for financing down the road, attractiveness? Like there's 2 parts to the project in terms of like just optically that you have to take into consideration for sure.
Yeah, and that's definitely the end goal, I think, is like, looking at consolidating a portfolio at some point and exiting and being able to, or creating a fund of some sort and dumping everything into the fund and sort of having the REIT model. But yeah, for now we're just acquiring and building and stabilizing and holding in the portfolio for the foreseeable future.
Well, it just seems like there's a recipe, like there's a handful of different pieces that need to go exactly as they should to be able to make these successful. And I think you hit it on the head. Location is probably the most important out of all of those things. You can overpay for something, but if you have a phenomenal location, you'll always be rented. And kind of goes back to the kind of the main goal or main saying of real estate is its location. Yeah, always.
We're always trying to be close to a subway station, close to at least a bus route for sure. And we generally, I have an affinity for not traveling in this city as much as possible. And so all of our projects are within like a 3-kilometer radius of each other. So it's also really nice for our crew, they're all living in the West End, and we do all of our projects in the West End. There's just so much available real estate here that we could never run out of projects in the West End. Everyone's like, well, why don't you go to the East? I'm like, because I don't want to. I rarely go to a site anymore anyway. But like, I don't want to travel an hour each direction to just go see if everything's going well. And so we generally just stick to this like little geographical area. It's close to transit. I know the West Side very well, and like I say, there's more than enough product here that we could never run out of things to do if we wanted to, and it's just so much easier to have everything in a close proximity to one another.
Well, in a market where rents are softening, like every little bit of bonus to the unit and location is going to help with your rent as well too. Like someone would rather pay $50 more to be closer to a transit line or some sort of transit than not being anywhere close to a subway station or a bus station or some sort of like train.
And parking too becomes a thing, right? Like we don't on most of our buildings now we'll have maybe 2 or 3 parking spots for 8 or 10 units. Like it's not, and we don't really see it as in one of our buildings has 0 parking, 9 units, 0 parking. And we never have any problems renting that unit, but it's 200 meters from a subway station on Dufferin. So it that really does have a big factor in leasing up those units. And if you're not close to transit, then you got to deal with parking. And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, we need a very different lot. We got a very different design because now we have to accommodate cars. There's one being built around the corner from me, and they're 18 units with 0 parking. It's all street parking. I'm like, that's going to be a tougher sell, I think, on people. Our 18 unit has 4-car parking, so it's got some at least, and we have 4 bedroom, 3 bathroom units. So we're kind of like looking at those units and saying, well, we would imagine that it's going to be a family of some sort, probably going to have a car, but at least we have those 4 like secured parking spots on site, and then there is street parking in the area as well. But to do 18 units with 0 parking, I'm like, that could be a tougher sell for that developer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Parking has always been the bane of every developer's
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, it's interesting because some of the large scale projects that I'm working on right now, the conversation actually is, okay, well, this is going to go into the ground in a year. It's going to take 2 years to build. In 3 years, what does robo-taxis look like? Like guys are really starting to think about how like transit is going to move in the future, and what that's going to do to parking and whatnot. Because yes, right now obviously it's a challenge, but systemically I think those thoughts are coming to development, and things are going to change where people maybe don't have cars anymore. So
well, the other thing is, like, even with some of our recent designs, we're looking at kitchens and going, do we really need this giant kitchen? Like, for me, I'm a single guy. Like I cook a little bit, but I'm like, I get meal delivery. I'm not like Uber Eats, like I order 10 meals at a time and I freeze them and I kind of eat them. I'm like, I rarely use like half my kitchen. Is that going to become the norm, where so many more things are moving in that direction? But that's, again, the ability to change your strategy. If every 18 months or so you've got a new project going into the ground, you can kind of look at like what's coming down the pipeline and do we need to make those adjustments, because you have the ability to be mobile and kind of make those quick decisions.
You're not redoing like a massive, drawings. You're just amending this.
And especially if you go, project after project, you can make small little changes as you go.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty easy thing to do if you're using the same blueprints over and over again.
Well, I was just gonna say that circles back into like becoming an expert in that size of project as well too. Like you can't understand how to make those micro adjustments if you're jumping 10, 15 units at a time. You're gonna have no idea.
Yeah.
You're gonna have no idea how to be able to where you can cut, how you're still maximizing the square footage. Like you can't do that if you haven't built those units before.
No. Even something as simple as like our heating systems, right? Like everybody is going with heat pumps now. And when I think they first came in, it was like, okay, just get that head on the wall and you just kind of forget about it, whatever else. And then now we're hearing a little bit of feedback, and sometimes like, oh, people don't like the look of them. They prefer the ducted systems, right? And so talking to our HVAC suppliers and contractors and looking at does it make sense to go with the ducted units or with the ductless and all that kind of stuff, and the cost, and just analyzing all those little things. But it's an easy thing to change from a project to project if it's just this one little minor thing that you're looking at, versus, like you say, going from 10 units to 25 is a very different thing. Now you got to factor in a whole bunch of stuff, not just like your heating system.
Well, it's also math too. If you run the number at $190 per head versus you have 4 or 5 heads in a unit and your NOI hit versus having one forced air system. What does it actually do to the underwritten value at the end of the project?
Exactly.
There's
but people don't think about that when they're doing their projects.
Yeah.
They haven't gone through their underwriting on the back end yet.
Yeah, it could be like, $10,000 with your NOI, which at a 4.5 cap's a lot of money.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, you know what? I love the fact that you were able to come here and talk about the bad things, the good things, what's working, the reality of it all.
Yeah.
I love watching the city grow. I love watching, people create great housing, and I think like where this is going, we need a whole lot more of yous and us's to be able to push that forward. But really appreciate you coming on today. People do want to get in contact with you, whether it's, I don't know if you build things for people or just yourself, or like if they're looking to find a great place to put their capital, whatever that might be, how they get a hold of you.
Yeah, my website is vorosgroup.com. My last name Voros. Yep. And then so we actually are starting to build for other people now a little bit, because my guys are very experienced on this specific product. I would love to say that we can build other people's stuff for $200 a foot, but that's not the case, because we have to actually add some profit in there. Whereas on our own projects, we don't need to do that. That's always a balance too of like, because now we kind of have, you mentioned it earlier, vertical integration. Like we have a construction company, right? And so that construction company has to make money in order to keep, surviving and all that kind of stuff. So it's really finding that balance between the construction company has to make a little bit of profit, but you don't want to make too much because then your development suffers. And so we're finding that balance there. But yeah, we do a little bit of work for other people now. And,
money you can put back in your own pocket. Like
it helps to have an operating company that sort of, can drive a little bit of revenue as well. So it's a nice thing to have. So
love that. Well, maybe next year we'll have you back to hear how the other 2 projects went.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to get them going.
Right on, man. Well, appreciate the time as always, guys. If you want to reach out. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.